I want to start this presentation with the most iconic image of 1980s and 1990s AIDS activism. This poster was created by a collective that eventually took the name Grand Fury, and it took them 6 months to finalize it. In a blog post on the New York Public Library website, one of the creators, Avram Finkelstein, wrote that they argued, quote, about issues, images, and fonts. They began wheat pasting it around Manhattan in February 1987, just before the formation of the group AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP. The collective chose the pink triangle, which I'll talk more about in a minute, because as Finkelstein wrote, quote, we realized any single photographic image would be exclusionary in terms of race, gender, and class, and opted instead to activate the LGBTQ audience through queer iconography. So we reviewed the symbols already in use. We felt that the rainbow flag lacked gravitas. The labrys might not be discernible to gay men. The lambda had class connotations. Thus, they settled on the pink triangle. The pink triangle is a symbol of the Nazis used to demarcate gay men in the concentration camps. German and Austrian gay men were sent to concentration camps as defilers of German blood and for participating in acts that were against, quote, wholesome popular sentiment. Gay men were sent to the camps for rehabilitation. About 15,000 were killed, others were targeted for hormone experiments, and several hundred were castrated. When World War II ended and the camps were closed, gay men remained criminals under German law. As Finkelstein wrote, because of this ghastly history, the Grand Fury Collective initially rejected the use of the pink triangle, but then embraced it, inverting the triangle as a gesture of a disavowal of victimhood. The poster and the slogan, "Silence equals death," became the symbols of AIDS activism. Finkelstein wrote that he had a hand in producing the image, but would argue that it was the AIDS activist community that actually created it, a community in search of a voice, one that went on to find it through the activation of its own social spaces. The image is a product of collective world-making. Grand Fury did not hesitate to say yes when ACT UP asked to use the image for their own purposes. The slogan, "Silence equals death," not only made it onto the iconic t-shirts like the one I'm wearing, but also was chanted at the marches and rallies, used in speeches, and used to invoke the power of speaking. All of us who are activists also became very familiar with the Martin Niemöller quotation, which exists in many forms, one of which is this version. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Silence equals death. If we did not speak up, no one else would. If we did not speak up, there would be more deaths. If we did not speak up, the government would continue to ignore that our friends, family members, and loved ones were dying. I want to take us back in time 30 years to the 1980s and the height of the AIDS crisis in the United States. I want to talk about the silence and talk about the noise. Although AIDS reporting started in 1981, and although it became clear that AIDS had become an epidemic shortly thereafter, President Ronald Reagan did not mention AIDS in public until 1987, and then only slowly and reluctantly, and not in any positive way. The silence came in the amendment Jesse Helms offered, and which was then added to the fiscal 1988 appropriation bill for the Department of Labor, Health, and Human Service. This amendment read, to prohibit the use of any funds provided under this act from being used to provide AIDS education, information, or prevention materials and activities that promote, encourage, and condone homosexual sexual activities or the intravenous use of illegal drugs. This made silence the law, a silence that prevented funding for programs that could actually help contain the disease. Explaining his amendment on the Senate floor, Helms said, We have got to call a spade and a perverted human being a perverted human being. The silence was also cultural. Gay men, lesbians, transgender people had not started coming out of the closet in large numbers. A 1987 Vanity Fair piece on the devastation AIDS was racking on the arts community included this. Quote, "Here is one Hollywood AIDS story. A young producer, gay, very much in the closet, issues an announcement that he's leaving the studio to start his own production company. Friends show concern at the obvious weight loss and pallid skin, but to all, he steadfastly denies he has AIDS and goes into virtual seclusion. A year later, his obituary with no mention of AIDS appears in Variety. Quote, he did have a few very close friends with him at the end, one acquaintance relates, but it was kept very quiet. People who get sick here tend to drop out and disappear." For those of us who lived through the AIDS crisis, we got used to decoding the obituaries, reading between the lines, looking for the clues that were only there, hidden in the shadows. Liberace was a bigger name than most, but the cause of death listed in his New York Times obituary was typical. Quote, "Cause of death was cardiac arrest due to congestive heart failure brought on by subacute encephalopathy. Encephalopathy is a degenerative disease of the brain. A contributing cause was aplastic anemia," end quote. That is a long way to try to avoid saying that he had died of AIDS or complications from AIDS. The silence came from families. As some gay men came out to their family members simultaneously about being a gay man and having AIDS, many of the family members reacted with fear and shame. When I first worked on this presentation, I put an inquiry out on Facebook. I wanted to convey something about the pre-treatment AIDS crisis to my students who were in their late teens and early 20s. I asked, I think more than any other external force, coming of age during the pre-treatment AIDS crisis shaped my life and made me who I am. The activism, in which I played a very small part, helped change the world. In the last 2 weeks of the semester in one of my classes, I will be teaching about the 1980s and 1990s and AIDS in the United States. I don't know how to convey the enormity of it to my students. If any of you have stories you want me to share or ideas about how to tell this story to mostly 18 to 22-year-old students, please chime in. My friend Heidi Hess replied, "I don't know, Sarah. When I was their age, I was going to multiple funerals a month. I was calling parents, telling them that their son had died and hearing they didn't want it in the papers. The remains, they didn't want it in the papers, they didn't want the remains, nor would they attend the funeral of their child. When I moved to Texas in 1999, I still had close to a dozen boxes of remains of people who had died, and no one claimed their ashes, not even their parents. How do you convey how that felt, the enormity, the travesty, the injustice? I just don't know, and it breaks my heart and darkens my soul," end quote. A few years ago, the Arkansas Times published a piece by David Kuhn about a woman named Ruth Coker Burks, who became enraged when she saw the way gay men were ignored, mistreated, and finally in their deaths, literally, simply thrown out. Through sheer accident, she was visiting a friend in the hospital. She had a conversation with a young man dying of AIDS who told her that he wanted to see his mother before he died. Burks wrangled the number from one of the nurses and called the young man's mother, who immediately hung up on her. Burks told the story of what happened next to Kuhn. "I called her back," Burks said. "I said, if you hang up on me again, I will put your son's obituary in your hometown newspaper, and I will list his cause of death." Then I had her attention. Her son was a sinner, the woman told Burks. She didn't know what was wrong with him and didn't care. She wouldn't come, as he was already dead to her as far as she was concerned. She said she wouldn't even claim his body when he died. It was a hymn Burks would hear again and again over the next decade, sure judgment and yawning hellfire, abandonment on a platter of scripture. Burks estimated that she worked with more than 1,000 people dying of AIDS over the course of the years. Of these, she said, only a handful of families didn't turn their backs on their loved ones. Silence. The silence of hatred, the silence of shame, the silence of fear. Silence equals death. While there was silence, there was also noise. The noise came from two different groups of people. One group was politicians and pundits calling for the government to imprison men with HIV or to tattoo HIV status on the bodies of gay men or intravenous drug users. The other group was the activists who broke the silence through their actions and through their art. Both of these groups invoked the Holocaust or the Nazi regime when they spoke. I want to start with the worst of the noise. I first became aware of this noise when I dropped out of college and moved to San Francisco in 1986. I immediately got swept up in the life and death of the city. I became more politically aware than I had been up to that point. One day, when I was standing on the corner of Castro and Market, a person approached me. I don't remember now if it was a man or a woman. Like many people in that neighborhood, this person had a petition and a cause. This person's cause was to gather signatures for California's Proposition 64, also known as the Larouche Initiative. More on Lyndon LaRouche in a minute. The ballot initiative read, AIDS is an infectious, contagious, and communicable disease, and that the condition of being a carrier of HIV virus is an infectious, contagious, and communicable condition. It requires both to be placed on the list of reportable disease and conditions maintained by the Director of the Department of Health Services, provides that both are subject to quarantine and isolation statutes and regulation, provides that the Department of Health Services personnel and all the health officers shall fulfill the duties and obligations set forth in the specified statutory provisions to preserve the public health from AIDS. I was not yet a sophisticated activist, but I'd been reading the LGBTQ press. I knew the codes here. Men who were HIV positive would be rounded up and quarantined in Alameda. Quarantines, camps. That sounded like the Holocaust. I was sophisticated enough to ask the petitioner, "You want to put gay men in camps?" "Yes," was the answer. Despite the fact that the Los Angeles Times reported that close to half the public favored quarantine, when the voters actually went to the polls, Proposition 64 only received about 29% of the total votes. Lyndon LaRouche, the man who had written this ballot initiative, is one of the most bizarre political figures of my lifetime, and that includes Donald Trump. Although he never obtained the national status Trump now has, he was not unpowerful politically. Although his own runs for president never went far, in states like California, he managed to get Proposition 64 on the ballot, and in states like Illinois, LaRoucheites managed to win elections. Although LaRouche's ballot proposal made us fear that states like California might target gay men like Nazis had done, in LaRouche's logic, it was those who opposed him who were the Nazis. In an executive intelligence review, a LaRouche organization publication entitled AIDS, Global Showdown, Mankind's Total Victory or Total Defeat, Warren J. Hammerman wrote that the government programs to address AIDS that were slowly being put in place by 1988, quote, openly revive the most odious policies of Nazi Germany and propose that those scaled up and implemented today. It was the government policies that spent money to research AIDS that were Nazi-like policies, not the idea to quarantine people with HIV. This slide comes from a June 1989 ACT UP protest called "First You Don't Exist, Now You're on the List." ACT UP protesters blocked traffic on the Brooklyn Bridge and surrounded the Department of Health to protest a proposal by the New York Health Commissioner, Stephen J. Joseph, to make the names of HIV-positive people public. The noise came from men like William F. Buckley, Jr., one of the most prominent conservative thinkers of his time. In a March 18, 1986 op-ed for the New York Times, this appeared in one of the best newspapers in the country, Buckley wrote, "Everyone detected with AIDS should be tattooed on the upper forearm to protect common needle users and on the buttocks to prevent the victimization of other homosexuals." When he dismissed the naysayers, he used the metaphor of the scarlet letter rather than that of the numbers tattooed on the arms of those who had been sent to concentration and death camps. He said this was not the scarlet letter, however, because it wasn't about shame, it was about prevention. For those of us who are activists, however, when we read his words, in our minds, we saw the concentration camp tattoos. Hateful noise. What could be done? Activists responded to government actions or inactions and to a wider culture of homophobia. While this activism took many forms, today I want to focus on the activism that referenced the Holocaust. Before I end with some examples, I want to make it clear that not all activists or concerned citizens were comfortable with this response. While Susan Sontag was willing to use war as a metaphor for disease, she felt as if Holocaust as a metaphor for AIDS went too far. She told the Vanity Fair reporter, "The Holocaust was inflicted by human beings on human beings. It's wrong to compare a situation in which there was real culpability to one in which there was none, and that's where the analogy leads. The word like the word genocide should not be used metaphorically." Not everyone agreed, however, that it was a false metaphor or that there was no real culpability. In 1989, Larry Kramer, one of the founders of the Gay Men's Health Crisis, one of the first organizations to address the AIDS crisis, and then a founder of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, published an anthology of some of his speeches and publications called Reports from the Holocaust, The Making of an AIDS Activist. Kramer, who was Jewish, was not shy about using the language of the Holocaust, as can be seen in a 1988 open letter to Dr. Anthony Fauci, at that point the National Institutes for Health's AIDS coordinator. In May, the letter was published in the Village Voice, and in June, it was published in the San Francisco Examiner. In it, Kramer, a longtime fan of shouting capital letters, wrote, "Why did you keep quiet for so long? I don't know, though it wouldn't surprise me if you kept quiet intentionally. I don't know, though it wouldn't surprise me if you are ordered to keep quiet by higher-ups somewhere. And you are a good lieutenant, like Adolf Eichmann." Kramer was referring, of course, to the man Adolf Eichmann, who in his trial for war crimes claimed that he was not guilty as he had only been following orders. Kramer was calling Fauci, a high-up government official, ostensibly in charge of one public health response to AIDS, a Nazi, as responsible for the death of human beings as Eichmann had been. Although AIDS activists eagerly read Susan Sontag's writings, they largely did not agree with her that no one was culpable. Activists carried signs like this one, AIDSgate, of Reagan. They covered Jesse Helms' house with a giant condom to make it clear that they felt he was as dangerous as HIV. By the time George Herbert Walker Bush assumed the office of the president, and because his administration did not more aggressively move to change the Reagan-era culture of ignoring the healthcare crisis, we chanted in the streets, 300,000 dead from AIDS, where was George? For those of us who wanted to move beyond the silence and the fear to policy change, there were many men and women who were culpable, who stood by and did nothing as people died. The art collective Grand Fury made this explicit in many of their posters, 3 of which are captured here. The one on the left refers to the high price of AZT. At the time, 1988, this poster was produced, AZT was the only drug approved for treatment of HIV. The one in the middle is self-explanatory. The one on the right includes these words: we, people of color, whether we are Afro-American, Native American, Hispanic, Latino, or Asian, women, men, IV drug users, partners of IV drug users, lesbians, gays, straights, the homeless, prisoners, and children affected by the AIDS crisis. Die. I actually can't read the number here, but it states the number of AIDS deaths at that moment as reported by the CDC. They, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Michael Dukakis, the NIH, the FDA, the US Congress, the Congressional Black and Hispanic Caucus, our national media, our national majority leaders do absolutely nothing. And then around the border, we recognize every AIDS death as an act of racist, sexist, and homophobic violence. For some activists, this was a Holocaust with culpable human beings, including culpable human beings inflicting, through their inaction, death on a large scale. Kramer seemed to be responding directly to Sontag when he wrote, quote, "Certainly a Holocaust does not require a Hitler to be effective. Certainly a Holocaust does not require deliberate intentionality on the part of one or several or many or a bureaucracy to be effective. Holocausts can occur, and probably most often do occur, because of inaction. It is not possible to locate one Hitler responsible for allowing this AIDS destruction to multiply. It is possible to locate a number of junior candidates. We don't have one Hitler, a friend of mine said. We have many Mengeles." Dr. Joseph Mengele, of course, was the Nazi doctor who supervised deaths and human experimentation at Auschwitz. Steve Abbott, a San Francisco writer, wrote this in an essay entitled, "Will We Survive the 1980s? Let us call this cruel indifference by its right name: intentional genocide. Silence and death, action and inaction, hatred and homophobia and creativity and inspired response, Holocaust references, one that scared us into action, and our own employment of those references. Sometimes when I tell people who know something about AIDS that I dropped out of college in 1986 and moved to San Francisco, they ask, 'How could you stand it?' Here is my answer. In the midst of all the death and suffering, there was love, laughter, creativity, and light. We loved each other because no one else would love us. Before I was a historian, I met people my age and older who knew a lot about history, about our history, the history of LGBTQ people. And maybe they didn't always get it right, but we passed the social memory of gay men and the Holocaust from person to person, pledging we will do everything in our power to never let this happen again. We took to the streets, we took to the press, we closed down institutions of power, and our street theater and our posters and our art was fabulous. In researching this presentation, one of the pieces I read was a New York Times blog by James Green titled, "When Political Art Mattered." In writing the post, he revisited, like I did, the Silence Equals Death poster. He wrote that he found that it still has the power to move and disturb. What's new is that it now has the power, at least over me, to comfort. People did something, it seems to say. People are good. Later in the post, he wrote, "There is a great deal of silence and a great deal of death, undeniably, but I wondered if the converse hadn't also been true. Had noise equaled life? Had art at last made a difference? I believe that if silence equals death, then noise indeed equals life. It has been one of the organizing principles of my life and activism, and I believe it is necessary to the work of trying to prevent another Holocaust. We don't always have to get the history entirely right, but I do believe we must always raise our voices against violence, hatred, prejudice, and danger."